Hi everyone, my name's Michelle and I'm the author of Hearthside blog. I've been working on creating accessible copies of all my blog posts, and this particular one is called Honoring the Land in a Post-Colonial Landscape. And this was one that was really difficult to write. I had it sitting there for months and months and months and just couldn't quite get it the way I wanted it. And I mean, I think it's one I'm always going to have room for improvement on. Just ignore the birds that are trying to talk over me a little bit here. So I was thinking a lot about honoring the land and how it isn't the same land perhaps as some of our ancestors were living on, and how different landscapes need to be honored in different ways. There's different spirits that live there, and honoring the traditions of the people who have lived on this land for longer than us. I was also thinking about how the Icelanders, they moved to a new land and had to have the same experience where they're creating relationships with new spirits that didn't exist in their previous home. So, building relationships with the Landvaettir, wherever you might live. So there are many mentions of Landvaettir and laws pertaining to the Landvaettir in the Book of Settlements, in the Proseda and the Sagas. And those aren't the same spirits that are here, but they are spirits that were important to our ancestors and important to the elder pagans and elder heathens. But when we go to approach the land spirits here in Canada or whatever country that you might live in, we have to approach them differently than the way that are in our written sources, because they aren't the same spirits. And beyond that, we also have to approach them differently depending on what region we live in. There were different Indigenous people living in different regions of Canada, and they all had their own way of relating with the land. My own traditions, I was influenced by so many different areas of land here in Canada, and also in my experience when I lived in Southeast Asia, and learning different ways of relating to these spirits and ways that they were different, but also ways that they were the same. So for example, when I was living in Thailand, most of the pieces of land that had houses or buildings on them, they had physical spirit homes right on the edge of the property. And the people who lived or worked there would leave offerings of food and drink and incense to these spirits. And if they wanted to change what was built on this land, or if they had to move the spirit house to a different location on that land, they had to call in a professional who could speak to the spirits on their behalf and get permission. And beyond that, they also believed that there were land spirits that lived in certain features in waterfalls, big big old trees, or that there were specific spots along the highway where there were a lot of car crashes, and that was because there was a displeased spirit who needed basically to be engaged in a gifting cycle in order to appease them and grant safe passage through those places. It really, I think that experience of living within a culture where the majority believed in the land spirits and that was part of their everyday existence, like that was eye-opening for me and really important to my own development of relationships with the land spirits when I came back to Canada. That's also the same as, like, we can take things from the written sources, from the lore, and from the Book of Settlements, and apply them to some extent, but we also have to keep in mind what those particular spirits on the piece of land that you're inhabiting are used to, and the best way of relating to them. So this could be the difference in types of offerings that you might leave. Like, you might leave some of the four sacred herbs to the indigenous people, the tobacco, sweetgrass, sage, cedar, and just the knowing about how to approach these spirits. We have to look to the indigenous people, and that's a tricky thing because we want to honor their traditions, but we also don't want to be asking them for too much without an equal exchange. So I feel like in my own life I've been very lucky to have good relationships with indigenous people who have shared a lot of their knowledge with me. But as I say, that this knowledge is very much regional, and you have to build those relationships just as you have to build the relationships with the land spirits. You can't just expect them to share their knowledge with an outsider. So I think the basics of it, regardless of your region, are you don't want to leave, for example, seeds from non-indigenous plants as an offering. So if you're leaving an offering of fruit, if it's not an indigenous fruit, you want to probably remove those seeds so they don't end up taking over the natural environment. I've heard that people in the United States, they often use cornmeal as an offering because it's ground up. If you just left corn seeds, they might propagate in a spot where they were not traditionally from, but instead leaving the cornmeal so that it can't damage that environment. I have in the past used birdseed as an offering, but I prefer not to do that outside of my land because I have had experiences where I've left it out in my yard and it's sprouted. Another thing to consider are the liquid offerings that you might leave. Milk is not a traditional offering in Canada to the Landvaettir. That would be very traditional in Europe. But the indigenous people, they didn't drink milk before the Europeans came over here. So they wouldn't have offered milk. And the same thing with alcohol. They didn't drink alcohol, and you shouldn't leave alcohol for the land spirits here, because I've even heard indigenous people say that that's disrespectful to leave an alcoholic offering to the land spirits here. Suggestions of a different drink that you could leave, herbal tea has been suggested, or just water. Those would have been substances that the indigenous people had and that they would be familiar with, and that the land spirits would be more familiar with. In Asia, it was actually interesting. For some reason, they always left pink Fanta, especially, as a liquid offering. But I think that if I did that in Canada, that would be seen as very strange. So each environment requires different things to be left out. I've also heard from indigenous people, like a traditional offering you might leave would be wild rice, potentially wild meat, but I have also steered away from wild meats because it attracts wasps or other things. Now, if you were leaving meat, you want to leave a traditional meat, not a Scandinavian dish like salted fish or even necessarily beef. It would be more likely to be bison. I think overall, though, the safest things to leave as offerings to the Landvaettir here would be tobacco or sweetgrass or something like that. And beyond that, it's really listening to the land. Observe how your offerings are received. Listen to the stories of the indigenous people in your region, and when they talk about spirits of the land, and get to know what sort of nature that they have. So yeah, the main thing is just be aware of your environment, what will be harmful to that environment, and avoid those things, and try to build grith bonds with the indigenous communities. But don't force yourself into their community either. It's about mutual respect. I feel like a lot of indigenous people, when they realize that land stewardship is a huge part of heathenry, they are more open and welcoming to us. But we still have to respect their own traditions and their own privacy as people. So that's pretty much where I was going with this. There's obviously a lot more I could say and a lot more that I still have to learn about it, but food for thought. Alright, I'll see you next time.